The smell of disinfectant and wet dog fur filled my nostrils as I worked under the harsh fluorescent lights. 3 in the morning, and here I was again, Dr. Michael Thompson, the veterinarian who couldn't say no to an emergency. The golden retriever on my examination table had been hit by a drunk driver, his left hind leg hanging at an angle that made my stomach clench. Easy, boy, I whispered, my hands steady despite the exhaustion weighing down my shoulders. We're going to fix you right up. The dog's brown eyes looked up at me with that kind of trust that never failed to humble me. Animals didn't care that I drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield. They didn't know that my clinic was 3 months behind on the mortgage, or that my wife Sarah had been picking up extra shifts at the hospital just so we could keep the lights on. Animals just knew I'd help them. If only humans were that simple. I was suturing the last layer of muscle when my phone buzzed against my hip. The caller ID made my blood run cold. Mercy General Hospital. Dad had been in their cardiac unit for 2 weeks now, ever since the stroke that left him barely conscious and hooked up to more machines than I had in my entire clinic. Dr. Thompson. The voice was professional, clinical. This is Nurse Martinez from Mercy General. I'm calling about your father, Frank Thompson. My hands paused mid-stitch. What's wrong? Did something happen? His condition has deteriorated significantly in the past hour. The doctors, well, they think you and your brother should get here as soon as possible. The phone felt heavy in my hand. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Dr. Thompson, your brother Richard is already here. He's been here for the past 3 hours. Of course he had. Richard probably got the call on his way home from some fancy business dinner, probably pulled up to the hospital in that silver Porsche of his, probably walked through those doors in a $1,500 suit that cost more than I made in a month. I finished the suture with shaking hands, my mind already racing ahead to what I'd find at the hospital. Richard would be there in the waiting room, checking his phone, maybe making calls about some big deal he was working on. The nurses would be fawning over him, successful businessman after all. They'd probably already pegged me as the disappointment son before I even walked through the door. You did good work tonight, Doc. I looked up to find Mrs. Patterson, the retriever's owner, standing in the doorway. She was still in her bathrobe and slippers, her gray hair mussed from sleep. In her hands was an envelope that I knew contained maybe $60 if I was lucky. Charlie's gonna be just fine, I told her, scratching behind the dog's ears. Keep him quiet for the next few days and bring him back in a week so I can check those stitches. Doctor, I know things are tight. She hesitated, holding out the envelope. This is all I have right now, but I promise I'll get you the rest next month. Mrs. Patterson, don't you worry about it. I waved her away, even though my bank account was screaming at me to take whatever she could give. Charlie's family, that's what matters. She smiled, the kind of smile that reminded me why I'd gone into veterinary medicine in the first place. It wasn't for the money, God knew there wasn't much of that. It was for moments like this, when you could take something broken and make it whole again. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Sarah. Honey, I just got the call from the hospital. Are you okay? I'm finishing up here, then heading over. I peeled off my surgical gloves, suddenly feeling every one of my 52 years. Richard's already there. Of course he is. Sarah's voice carried that particular tone she used whenever my brother's name came up. Not quite anger, but something close to it. Michael, whatever happens tonight, just remember that you've been the one taking care of your father all these years. You're the one who drove him to every doctor's appointment, who sat with him during chemo, who held his hand when the treatments made him too weak to feed himself. I know, but no buts. You're a good son, Michael Thompson. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise. After I hung up, I stood in the quiet of my clinic, surrounded by the tools of my trade and the lingering smell of antiseptic. The walls were covered with thank you cards from pet owners, children's drawings of dogs and cats I'd saved, photos of families reunited with their beloved animals. This was my world. Small, maybe, but real. Richard's world was boardrooms and stock options, corner offices with views of the city skyline, handshakes that moved millions of dollars from one account to another. He'd never understood why I'd chosen this life, and I'd never been able to explain it to him. When we were kids, Richard was the one who brought home straight A's while I struggled with dyslexia that wasn't diagnosed until I was 12. He was the one who scored the winning goal in the championship game while I warmed the bench. He was the one Dad bragged about to his friends at the hardware store, the son who was going places. And I was the one who stayed behind when Richard left for college on a full scholarship, the one who helped Dad run the hardware store after Richard got too important to come home for Christmas, the one who held Mom's hand during those final months when the cancer ate her alive and Richard was too busy closing some big deal to visit. I locked up the clinic and walked out into the cold October night. The stars were clearer out here in rural Ohio than they'd ever been in the city where Richard lived. As I drove toward the hospital, I found myself wondering if Dad would even recognize me when I got there, or if his mind would be too clouded by medication and the aftermath of the stroke. What I didn't wonder about was whether Richard would be holding court in the waiting room, already making decisions about Dad's care, already positioning himself as the responsible son who'd swooped in to handle everything. That was just who Richard was, the golden child, even at 55 years old. And I was still the lesser son, driving through the night in a car that needed new brake pads, rushing to say goodbye to a father who'd probably forgotten my name. Dad died 3 days later, quietly in his sleep, just as the morning shift was changing at the hospital. I was in the cafeteria getting coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with cardboard when the call came. Richard was in meetings all day, some acquisition deal that couldn't wait apparently. So I handled the funeral arrangements alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even in death, Dad was still waiting for Richard to show up. Now here I sat in Elena Vasquez's law office, my good shoes pinching my feet, and my only decent tie feeling like a noose around my neck. The leather chair across from me held my brother, perfectly pressed as always, checking his phone every 30 seconds like the stock market might collapse if he wasn't monitoring it. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. Elena walked in carrying a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s, the kind of lawyer who probably charged more per hour than I made in a week. I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a remarkable man. Thank you, Ms. Vasquez. Richard slipped his phone into his jacket pocket with practiced smoothness. I assume this won't take long? I have a conference call with Tokyo in an hour. Elena's eyebrows lifted slightly. Actually, Mr. Thompson, your father's will is quite comprehensive. We'll need to go through it carefully. I shifted in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. Whatever Dad wanted is fine with me. I just want to make sure his wishes are respected. That's very noble of you, Michael. Richard's tone suggested nobility was something I couldn't afford. But let's be practical here. Dad knew I was better equipped to handle his financial affairs. Elena opened the folder and pulled out a document that looked like it had been drafted by a team of Supreme Court justices. Your father updated his will 6 times in the past 18 months. The final version was executed just 3 weeks before his passing. 3 weeks! That meant Dad had been working on this while he was in the hospital. Maybe even while Richard was off closing his precious deals. The estate consists of the family home on Maple Street, valued at approximately $1.2 million, investment portfolios worth roughly $8.7 million, the hardware store building and land valued at $600,000, and various personal effects and accounts totaling approximately $4.3 million. My coffee cup rattled against the saucer when I set it down. $15 million. I'd known Dad had done well with his investments over the years, but I had no idea it was that much money. Richard leaned forward, suddenly very interested. And the distribution? Elena adjusted her reading glasses. I, Franklin James Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath 95% of my estate, including all real property, investments, and liquid assets, to my eldest son, Richard Michael Thompson. The words hit me like a physical blow. 95%. I'd expected Richard to get more, he was the successful one after all. But this felt like Dad had reached out from beyond the grave just to slap me across the face one more time. Richard couldn't suppress his smile. And the remaining 5% goes to Michael James Thompson, along with Dad's personal effects and the contents of his workshop. 5% of 15 million was still more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. But that wasn't the point. The point was that even in death, Dad was telling me I was worth exactly 5% as much as my brother. However, Elena continued, and something in her tone made both of us look up. There are certain conditions attached to this inheritance. Conditions? Richard's smile faltered. What kind of conditions? Elena reached into the folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. Your father left specific instructions that this envelope was to be opened and read aloud only after the initial will reading. Just open it, Richard said, impatience creeping into his voice. What could the old man possibly have cooked up? Elena broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. As she read it silently, her eyebrows climbed higher and higher up her forehead. Well, I asked, Your father was apparently quite concerned about ensuring his final wishes were properly carried out. Meaning what, exactly? Richard was drumming his fingers on the arm of his chair, a habit he'd had since childhood when he was getting frustrated. Meaning that Richard's inheritance comes with a very specific set of requirements that must be fulfilled over the next 24 months. If these requirements are not met to the satisfaction of a designated oversight committee, the entire estate will be redistributed according to alternative instructions. Richard shot to his feet. That's ridiculous. You can't put conditions on an inheritance like that. It's my money now. Actually, Mr. Thompson, you'd be surprised how creative estate law can be when properly applied. Elena's voice was steady, professional. Your father worked very closely with my firm to ensure these provisions would hold up under legal scrutiny. What are the conditions? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Elena looked directly at Richard. The requirements fall into 12 distinct categories, each designed to demonstrate what your father termed genuine family responsibility and emotional growth. You'll need to successfully complete challenges in areas such as charity work, family engagement, community service, and personal accountability. Richard's face was turning an interesting shade of red. Family engagement? What the hell does that mean? It means, for example, that you'll need to host weekly family dinners with Michael and Sarah for 6 consecutive months. It means you'll need to provide meaningful support to Michael's veterinary practice. It means you'll need to make public amends for past behavior that may have damaged family relationships. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on Elena's bookshelf. Richard was staring at the wall like he could burn a hole through it with his eyes, while I was trying to process what I'd just heard. Dad had set up some kind of elaborate test for Richard, with $15 million as the prize. And if Richard failed, what happens if he doesn't complete the challenges? I asked. Elena consulted the document again. In the event that Richard Thompson fails to satisfy the oversight committee within the prescribed time frame, the entire estate passes to Michael Thompson, with Richard receiving only the 5% originally designated for his brother. Richard turned to stare at me, and for the first time in our lives, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Elena called me 3 days later while I was stitching up a tabby cat that had tangled with a raccoon. Michael, could you come to my office this afternoon? There are aspects of your father's will we need to discuss privately. What kind of aspects? I set down my suturing needle. Richard gets 95% if he jumps through Dad's hoops. Seems straightforward. Trust me, it's far more complicated than that. Can you be here by 3? 2 hours later, I found myself back in Elena's office, but this time she'd spread out a dozen documents across her conference table, each one marked with colored tabs and sticky notes. Your father spent 2 years planning this, Michael. What you heard the other day was just the opening act. Elena gestured to the papers. These are the actual conditions Richard has to fulfill. I picked up the first document. Richard had to host weekly family dinners for 6 months. Not just invite us over, but personally plan, prepare, and serve meals while engaging in what Dad had termed meaningful family conversation. Dad actually defined what counts as meaningful conversation. No business talk, no phone calls during dinner, no interrupting others, plus specific topics including family history, shared memories, and future plans involving the whole family. The second document was even more specific. Richard had to donate 50% of his annual income to charities chosen by me, plus personally volunteer at each organization for 4 hours monthly with detailed progress reports. This is insane, I muttered, but kept reading. Challenge 3 required public apologies, including a letter to the local newspaper acknowledging how he'd treated me. Challenge 4 mandated he work at my clinic as an unpaid assistant for 40 hours to understand the value of Michael's work. Elena, how is any of this legally enforceable? She smiled genuinely for the first time since I'd met her. Your father established an oversight committee to monitor Richard's progress and determine whether he's fulfilling the spirit of the requirements, not just the letter. Who's on this committee? Dr. Morrison, who treated your father for 20 years, Pastor Williams from First Methodist, and myself, representing the legal aspects. Why are you showing me this? Shouldn't Richard be learning about his challenges? He is. I'm meeting with him tomorrow. Elena gathered the papers. But your father left specific instructions that you should understand the full scope of what's happening here. Which is what, exactly? Your father believed Richard had lost his way, but that underneath all that arrogance, there was still the brother you grew up with. Elena turned to face me. These challenges aren't designed to punish Richard. They're designed to teach him how to care about someone other than himself. And if he can't learn, then 15 million becomes your problem instead of his. Elena's smile turned wry. If Richard fails, you inherit it with interest and penalties, over 18 million total. $18 million. I could rebuild my clinic, expand it into a full animal hospital. Sarah could quit her hospital job and pursue that art degree. We could actually have the kids we'd talked about but never felt secure enough to consider. The challenges get progressively more difficult, Elena said quietly. What I showed you today are just the first 4. The final challenges? Let's just say your father really wanted Richard to understand what putting family first actually means. My phone rang as I drove home. Richard's name flashed on the screen. Hey, Richard, we need to talk. His voice was tight, controlled fury. I just got out of my meeting with Elena. This whole thing is completely insane, Michael. Which part? The charity work or the family dinners? All of it. Dad's trying to control us from beyond the grave, making me jump through hoops like some trained circus animal. His control was slipping. And the oversight committee? Who the hell are they to judge whether I'm being sincere enough? Maybe that's the point, I said quietly. Maybe Dad wanted people who actually care about sincerity to be the judges. Don't give me that psychological bullshit, Michael. This is about money. $15 million. And if I don't dance to Dad's tune, you get it all instead. The line went quiet. I could hear Richard breathing hard. So here's what's going to happen, he continued, his voice cold now. I'm going to play Dad's little game, and I'm going to win. But don't think for a second that any of it's real. Don't think that forcing me to have dinner with you once a week is going to magically turn us into the Brady Bunch. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me with the distinct feeling that Dad's elaborate plan might be about to backfire in ways he never imagined. The invitation arrived on cream-colored stationery with Richard's company letterhead, delivered by courier like it was a business contract instead of a dinner invitation. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson request the pleasure of your company for dinner this Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. Dress code business casual. Sarah held the card between two fingers like it might bite her. Business casual? For a family dinner? Who talks like that? Someone who's never hosted a family dinner in his life, I said. But something in my chest felt lighter than it had in weeks. Maybe Richard was actually going to try. Saturday evening found us standing on the doorstep of the house I'd grown up in, the house that now belonged to my brother. Richard had hired someone to landscape the front yard. Gone were Dad's practical rose bushes, replaced by geometric hedges that looked like they belonged at a corporate headquarters. Richard opened the door wearing a navy blazer over khakis, his hair perfectly styled like he was about to give a presentation to shareholders. Michael, Sarah, right on time. His smile was so bright it could have powered the porch light. Come in, come in. I've prepared something special for tonight. The living room had been completely redecorated. Gone was Dad's comfortable recliner, replaced by matching leather furniture that looked expensive and uncomfortable. The walls that used to hold family photos now displayed abstract art that probably cost more than my truck. Richard, you didn't have to go to all this trouble, Sarah said, though her tone suggested she wished he hadn't. Nonsense. Family is the most important thing, right? Richard clapped his hands together. I've hired Chef Roberto from Chez Laurent to prepare a 5-course meal. I thought we could start with champagne and caviar in the living room. I exchanged glances with Sarah. This wasn't a family dinner. This was Richard showing off, trying to impress the oversight committee by throwing money around. Actually, I said, maybe we could just sit in the kitchen like we used to when we were kids. Remember those Sunday dinners when Mom would make pot roast? Something flickered across Richard's face, annoyance maybe, or panic. The kitchen, but I've set up the dining room with the good china, and Chef Roberto has prepared molecular gastronomy interpretations of classic American comfort food. Molecular what, now? Sarah asked. It's when they deconstruct traditional dishes and rebuild them using modern culinary techniques, Richard explained, sounding like he was reading from a Wikipedia article. For example, tonight's meatloaf is actually a lamb foam with deconstructed mashed potato spheres and essence of green bean reduction. I sat down heavily on one of the uncomfortable leather chairs. Richard, do you even know what Dad's favorite meal was? Of course I do, but Richard's pause lasted a beat too long. He liked upscale cuisine, fine dining. Tuna casserole, I said quietly. Every Friday night for 30 years, Mom made tuna casserole with crushed potato chips on top. And Dad said it was better than anything you could get in a fancy restaurant. Richard's perfect smile faltered. Well, I thought we could elevate our dining experience, show that we're sophisticated people. Sophisticated for who? Sarah asked. We're family. We don't need to impress each other. Before Richard could answer, a man in a white chef's coat emerged from the kitchen carrying a silver tray with what looked like 3 small clouds on it. The amuse-bouche, Chef Roberto announced in an accent that sounded more fake than Richard's enthusiasm. Reconstructed chicken soup, served as an edible vapor with essence of nostalgia. Sarah and I stared at the tray. The edible vapor looked like cotton candy, if cotton candy could somehow taste disappointed in itself. This is supposed to be chicken soup? I asked. Not just chicken soup, Richard said quickly, but the emotional memory of chicken soup, distilled into its purest form. I took a bite. It tasted like air with a faint hint of bouillon cube. Richard, I said, setting down the bizarre knot soup, can I talk to you privately for a minute? His smile got even brighter, which I hadn't thought was possible. Of course, we're family. We should communicate openly. I led him into Dad's old study, where the only things that hadn't changed were the built-in bookshelves and the worn leather chair where Dad used to read his evening paper. What are you doing? I asked. I'm hosting a family dinner, just like the challenge requires. I'm engaging in meaningful conversation. I'm providing hospitality. I'm Corbly Pugh. You're performing, I interrupted. This whole thing is an act. The fancy food, The redecorated house, that chef who sounds like he learned English from watching cooking shows. Richard's smile finally cracked. What do you want from me, Michael? I'm doing exactly what Dad's will requires. Dad wanted us to be a family, not to pretend to be characters in some luxury lifestyle magazine. Well, maybe Dad should have thought of that before he spent 30 years making me feel like nothing I did was ever good enough. The words came out sharper than Richard had probably intended. You think this is easy for me? You think I know how to do this family stuff? For the first time since this whole thing started, Richard sounded like a human being instead of a corporate spokesman. I sat down in Dad's old chair, the leather creaking familiarly under my weight. When we were kids, I said, remember those times when Mom and Dad would go out for their anniversary dinner? You'd make grilled cheese sandwiches, and we'd eat them while watching old movies on TV. You always wanted extra butter on yours, Richard said quietly, and you always let me have the last piece of your sandwich even though you were still hungry. I looked up at him. That's what Dad wanted, Richard. Not some restaurant experience, just us. Richard ran his hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time since I could remember. I don't know how to do that anymore, Michael. I've spent so many years being successful that I forgot how to just be. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to Sarah making polite conversation with Chef Roberto in the dining room. What if we started over? I suggested. Tell Chef Roberto he can go home, order a pizza, sit in the kitchen and just talk. The oversight committee is going to think I failed the first challenge. Maybe they'll think you figured out what the challenge actually was. Richard looked around Dad's study, taking in the familiar books and the family photos that he hadn't bothered to remove from this one room. Pepperoni and mushroom, he asked. Extra cheese, I said. For the first time in 20 years, my brother smiled at me, and it looked real. 3 weeks into Richard's family dinner challenge, I couldn't sleep. Something had been nagging at me since our pizza night. The way Dad had structured this elaborate test. 2 years of planning meetings with Elena, 2 years of revisions. 2 years of what? At 2 in the morning, I drove to the old house. Richard had given me a key after our first real dinner. I told myself I just wanted to sit in Dad's study, maybe understand why he'd put us through this psychological maze. But once I was there, surrounded by Dad's books and the lingering smell of his pipe tobacco, I found myself really looking at the room. Dad had been meticulous about record keeping, but there was something off about his desk, a locked drawer I'd never noticed. The drawer opened with a satisfying click, revealing a manila folder marked Final Arrangements Private. Inside were documents that made my hands shake. Medical records from 3 different doctors, all dated within 6 months. Not stroke treatment records, clean bills of health. Normal brain scans, blood work showing a perfectly healthy 78-year-old man. Correspondence with Dr. Patricia Chen at County General, discussing theatrical requirements for simulated medical emergency and temporary pharmaceutical intervention for consciousness alteration. My vision blurred. Dad hadn't had a stroke. Dad hadn't been dying. Dad had staged the entire thing. A rental agreement for a Cascade Mountains cabin, dated 2 weeks after Dad's supposed death. Security camera installation receipts. Then a handwritten note in Dad's familiar scrawl. Michael will figure it out first. When he does, he'll find me at the cabin. Tell him to bring Richard. Time they both learned what family really means. I tried calling Elena. Voicemail. Elena, it's Michael. Call me back immediately. I know what Dad did. I know he's not dead. Sarah was waiting when I stumbled home at 4 a.m. Where have you been? She took one look at my face. Michael, what happened? I showed her the documents. Her face went through the same shock mine had. He's alive, she whispered. Your father faked his own death. Not just that. I sat down hard. Sarah, I think I've been the real heir all along. Richard's challenges aren't a test to see if he deserves inheritance. They're a distraction while Dad watches from his mountain cabin. Sarah read through the papers, her nursing background helping with medical terminology. These pharmaceutical records are for drugs that simulate stroke symptoms without actual damage. And look, there's a timeline. Dad's been planning this for 3 years, not 2. 3 years, since right after Mom died, right after Richard missed her funeral for business in Shanghai. Michael, there's something else. Sarah held up a document I'd missed. This is a real estate transfer, dated 6 months ago. Your father already signed everything over to you. Richard never actually inherited it. The room spun. What? Look at the signatures. Notarization date. Your father transferred ownership of everything, house, investments, all of it, to you 6 months before his supposed death. Richard's challenges aren't about earning inheritance. They're about learning to be the brother you deserved. My phone rang. Elena, Michael, I got your message. I think it's time we talked. You knew? You've known all along. Your father made me promise to let you figure it out yourself. He said you'd understand the lesson better if you discovered it. Elena's voice was gentle. Are you ready to see him? Is Richard ready to see him? That depends. Has Richard learned anything from his challenges? I thought about our pizza dinner. Richard's corporate mask slipping when he admitted he didn't know how to just be human anymore. Maybe, but Elena, when Richard finds out Dad's been manipulating us for months, your father is counting on you to help Richard understand. That's why you were always the real heir, Michael. Not because you're more deserving of money, but because you're more capable of forgiveness. After hanging up, Sarah and I sat in our kitchen as sunrise came. So what now? Sarah asked. I looked out at the morning light, thinking about Richard going through family dinner motions, not knowing everything he understood about Dad's death was a lie. Now I tell Richard that the man pulling our strings is alive and waiting in a mountain cabin. And then we find out what the hell Dad thinks he's accomplished with this insane plan. But I was starting to understand. Dad hadn't just faked his death. He'd created circumstances for both sons to become better men. Richard was learning empathy through challenges, and I was learning I had more strength than I'd believed. The question was whether either of us would forgive him for the deception once we discovered how far he'd gone to save his family. I decided not to tell Richard about Dad immediately. Instead, I started watching him the way he'd never bothered to watch me, carefully, quietly, looking for cracks in his performance. It didn't take long to find them. Richard's fifth challenge required him to make public amends for past behavior. Elena had scheduled it for the monthly town council meeting, where half the community would witness whatever apology Richard managed to deliver. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row. Richard walked in wearing his most expensive suit, the one he usually reserved for board meetings with Fortune 500 companies. He looked confident, prepared, like a man who'd rehearsed his lines perfectly. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his voice carrying that practiced corporate tone. I've asked for a few minutes of your time tonight because I owe this community, and especially my brother Michael, a sincere apology. So far, so scripted. For too many years, I allowed my professional success to make me arrogant. I treated my family, particularly Michael, as if their contributions were somehow less valuable than my own achievements in business. The words sounded polished, like they'd been written by a public relations firm. I found myself leaning forward, waiting for something real. Michael has spent his career serving this community, caring for your animals, often without proper compensation because he puts compassion before profit. Richard's voice cracked slightly on the word compassion, and for a moment I saw something genuine flicker across his face. But then he caught himself, straightened his shoulders, and continued with his prepared remarks about learning to value family and community service. The moment of authenticity vanished as quickly as it had appeared. After the meeting, I caught Richard in the parking lot. Nice speech, I said. Thank you, I meant every word, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. Did you? Because there was about 30 seconds in the middle where you sounded like you actually meant it, and then you went back to sounding like you were delivering a quarterly earnings report. Richard's jaw tightened. What do you want from me, Michael? I apologized publicly, just like the challenge required. I'm doing everything Dad's will demands. Are you? What's that supposed to mean? I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo I'd taken earlier that day. Richard's supposed volunteer hours at the animal shelter. Except in the photo, Richard was sitting in his car in the parking lot, talking on his phone while someone else signed him in. You've been faking your volunteer work, I said, paying people to cover for you while you handle business calls. That's not exactly what Dad had in mind when he talked about genuine community service. Richard's face went white. How long have you been following me? Long enough to document some interesting patterns. I scrolled through more photos on my phone. Here you are having your assistant write charity checks while you were in meetings. Here's the catering receipt from your home-cooked family dinners. Should I keep going? You little bastard. Richard stepped closer, his corporate mask finally slipping completely. You're trying to sabotage me. I'm trying to understand something, I said, meeting his eyes. Why are you working so hard to fake your way through these challenges when actually doing them might be easier? Because I don't know how to do them. The words exploded out of him, loud enough that people leaving the town hall turned to stare. I don't know how to volunteer at an animal shelter without feeling like an idiot. I don't know how to cook a family dinner without hiring help. I don't know how to apologize for 30 years of being a terrible brother without sounding like I'm reading from a script. The honesty in his voice stopped me cold. This wasn't Richard the successful businessman or Richard the manipulative older brother. This was just a scared man who'd built his identity around being better than everyone else and suddenly didn't know who he was supposed to be. Richard, no, let me finish. He ran his hands through his hair, destroying his perfect styling. You want to know why I'm faking it? Because the real version of me trying to do this stuff would be pathetic. You'd watch me struggle to figure out which end of a dog leash goes where, and you'd finally see what I've spent my whole life trying to hide, that I'm not actually better at anything that matters. We stood there in the parking lot while the last few cars pulled away, leaving us alone under the streetlights. You know what the worst part is? Richard continued. I'm starting to think Dad knew this would happen. I think he designed these challenges to be impossible for someone like me to fake for very long. Maybe that was the point, I said quietly. What do you mean? This was it, the moment I'd been dreading since I found those documents in Dad's desk. The moment I had to decide whether to tell Richard the truth or let Dad's psychological experiment continue. Richard, there's something you need to know about Dad's will, about all of this. What are you talking about? I pulled out the manila folder I'd been carrying in my truck. Dad didn't just plan these challenges to test you. He planned them to teach both of us something. Richard opened the folder and started reading. I watched his face change as he processed the medical records, the cabin rental agreement, the real estate transfers that showed he'd never actually inherited anything. This can't be real. His voice was barely a whisper. Dad's alive, Richard. He's been watching us from a cabin in the mountains, orchestrating this whole thing like some kind of elaborate therapy session. Richard sank against his car, the folder slipping from his hands. He's alive. The question is, I said, what are we going to do about it? Richard looked up at me, and for the first time since we were kids, I saw him without any masks or pretenses, just my older brother, confused and hurt, and trying to figure out how the world had suddenly turned upside down. I don't know, he said. I honestly don't know. But I did. And that's when I realized Dad had been right about one thing. I was ready to take control of this situation in a way I never had been before. Then let me tell you what we're going to do, I said. We're going to drive up to that cabin tomorrow morning, and we're going to have a conversation with our father about what the hell he thinks he's been teaching us. Richard nodded slowly, and then what? Then we figure out how to be brothers without Dad pulling the strings. Richard didn't show up at my house the next morning like we'd planned. When I called him at 8, then 9, then 10, all I got was voicemail. By 11, I drove over to the family house. I found him in Dad's study, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and legal documents scattered across the floor. He was still wearing his suit from the town council meeting, wrinkled now, his tie hanging loose around his neck. Richard? He looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Do you know how long I've been trying to be the perfect son? 43 years, Michael. 43 years of trying to prove I was worth something. I stepped around the papers, financial records, old report cards, performance reviews. It looked like Richard had been going through every document in the house. What are you looking for? Evidence, Richard said, taking another swig from a bottle of Dad's bourbon. Evidence that he actually loved me. But you know what I found instead? He held up a manila folder. Performance evaluations, psychological assessments, business school recommendations, everything about me reduced to data points and metrics. I sat down across from him. Richard, you're drunk. Maybe we should. I'm not drunk enough. He laughed bitterly. You want to know what the worst part is? I hired a private investigator yesterday. After you showed me those documents, I needed to know how deep this rabbit hole went. My stomach dropped. What did you find? Richard dumped photos across the desk. They showed Dad in casual clothes, very much alive, walking around a small mountain town. Dad buying groceries. Dad at a coffee shop. Dad talking to a woman I didn't recognize. 3 months, Michael. He's been living up there for 3 months, playing house with some widow named Margaret while we danced to his tune down here like trained monkeys. The photos felt like a physical blow, seeing Dad looking healthier and happier than he'd been in years. There's more, Richard continued, his voice getting unstable. The investigator traced the financial records. Do you want to know what our dear old dad spent on this psychological experiment? $230,000. Hospital bribes, fake medical equipment, paying actors to play doctors. He spent $250,000 to mess with our heads. Richard, calm down. Calm down. He shot to his feet, swaying. Our father faked his own death, Michael. He put us through months of grief and manipulation. And you want me to calm down? I know you're angry, but I'm not angry, little brother. I'm destroyed. Because you know what the really sick part is? It worked. His sick little game actually worked. Richard walked to the window, staring out at the backyard where we'd played as kids. I was starting to like those family dinners, he said quietly. Even the fake ones with the catered food. For the first time in 20 years, I was looking forward to spending time with you and Sarah. I was starting to remember what it felt like to have a family. Richard, but it was all based on a lie. He spun around, face flushed with alcohol and fury. Everything I felt, every moment of connection, every stupid hope that maybe we could actually be brothers again, it was all part of his manipulation. He picked up one of the photos of Dad. Do you know what I'm going to do, Michael? I'm going to destroy him the same way he destroyed me. Something cold settled in my chest. What are you talking about? I'm going to the police. Fraud, identity theft, insurance fraud. I'm going to make sure our loving father spends his golden years in prison. You can't do that. Watch me. Richard pulled out his phone. I've already talked to a lawyer. We have enough evidence to put him away for 10 years. I stood up. Richard, think about what you're saying. Yes, Dad manipulated us. But he did it because what? Because he loves us. Richard's laugh was sharp. People who love you don't put you through psychological torture, Michael. But the lessons worked, I said desperately. You said it yourself. You were starting to enjoy spending time with family. Built on lies, Richard shouted. All of it built on lies. He was dialing and I realized he was serious. Richard, please. Let's go to the cabin first. Let's talk to him. Talk to him. Richard's finger hovered over the call button. What's left to talk about? He made his choice when he decided to play God with our lives. He's still our father. No, Richard said, suddenly deadly calm. Frank Thompson died 3 months ago. What's living in that cabin is just some stranger who thinks psychological manipulation is a form of love. He pressed the call button. Yes, I'd like to report a fraud case, he said into the phone. Identity theft, insurance fraud, falsified death certificates. I grabbed the phone from his hand and hung up. What the hell are you doing? Richard demanded. Stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life. Richard tried to grab the phone back. Give me the phone, Michael. No, give me the goddamn phone. I said no. For the first time in our lives, I was shouting at Richard. You want to destroy Dad? Fine. But you're going to have to go through me first. Richard stared at me, swaying, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't identify. You're protecting him, he said finally. After everything he's done to us, you're still protecting him. I'm protecting our family. What's left of it? Richard sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his 55 years. There is no family, Michael, there never was. Just a father and 2 sons who never figured out how to love each other without games and manipulation and lies. He put his head in his hands. I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend that any of this was real or meaningful or worth saving. I looked at my brother, drunk, broken, and more honest than he'd ever been, and realized that Dad's plan had worked, just not the way he'd intended. Richard had finally learned what it felt like to be vulnerable. The question was whether either of us would survive the lesson. Richard passed out on Dad's couch around midnight. I covered him with a blanket and sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to figure out what to do next. My brother wanted to destroy our father, and honestly, I wasn't sure he was wrong. At 6 in the morning, someone knocked on the door. I opened it to find a young woman in hiking boots and a park ranger uniform holding a manila envelope. Are you Michael Thompson? Yes, I'm Ranger Sarah Martinez. A gentleman asked me to deliver this to you personally before 8 a.m. The envelope had my name in Dad's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet and car keys I didn't recognize. Michael, if you're reading this, Richard hired that private investigator I've been expecting. I know he found the photos. I know he's angry enough to want me arrested. I know you probably stopped him, at least temporarily. The blue Honda in the driveway is yours now. Drive to Cascade Lake. Take the North Trail to mile marker 7. There's a cabin there. Come alone first. I need to explain something before Richard gets involved. There's something about Richard I never told you. Something I never told him either because I was a coward. But if there's any chance of saving our family, you need to understand the whole truth. Michael, Richard isn't your half-brother. He's not related to us by blood at all. I'll explain everything when you get here. Please come quickly. I'm running out of time in more ways than one. Your father, Frank. P.S. The woman in the photos is Margaret Chen, Dr. Patricia Chen's sister. She's been helping me with my real medical situation. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. Richard wasn't my brother? And what real medical situation? Richard stirred on the couch. Michael? What time is it? Almost 7. I folded the letter. Richard, I need to go somewhere. Can you stay here until I get back? Where are you going? He sat up, wincing. To get answers, real ones this time. The drive to Cascade Lake took 40 minutes through winding mountain roads. Mile marker 7 led to a steep trail disappearing into pine forest. After 20 minutes of hiking, I saw smoke from a chimney. The cabin was small but well kept, with solar panels and a vegetable garden. Someone had been living here comfortably for months. Dad opened the door before I could knock. He looked older than in Richard's photos, thinner, with a yellow tinge to his skin that I recognized from veterinary training. But his eyes were alert, and his smile was genuine for the first time in years. Hello, Michael. Dad. The word came out harder than I'd intended. Come in, we have a lot to talk about, and probably not much time. The cabin was warm, filled with books and family photos from our old house. Medical records and legal documents covered the kitchen table. Before you say anything, Dad said, I want you to know that everything I did because I love both of you. Richard wants to have you arrested. I know, I saw what happened last night through security cameras. Dad sat heavily in a worn leather chair. That's why I asked you to come alone. There are things you need to understand before we try to help Richard. Like the fact that he's not actually my brother. Dad's face went pale. You read that part. Is it true? Dad nodded. Richard was adopted when he was 3. His birth parents died in a car accident, and your mother and I took him in. We never told him because we wanted him to feel like he belonged completely. I sank into the chair across from him. Why tell me this now? Because Richard's whole life has been built around trying to prove he's worthy of being a Thompson. Every achievement, every success, every moment of arrogance, it all comes from a scared little boy who sensed he was different and thought he had to earn his place in our family. Dad leaned forward. The challenges weren't really about teaching him empathy, Michael. They were about showing him that he already belonged, that he didn't have to prove anything. But he failed most of them. No, he didn't. He learned to enjoy family dinners with you. He started volunteering. He made that public apology, and for 30 seconds it was real. Dad's eyes were bright with tears. Richard has been changing. The problem is he's changing because he thinks it's part of a game, not because he's finally allowing himself to be loved. What about your medical situation? What did you mean about running out of time? Dad pulled out a folder from the table stack. I have pancreatic cancer, Michael. Stage 4. I've had it for 8 months. The world tilted. What? The stroke was fake, but the cancer is very real. I've been getting treatment up here with Margaret's help. She's a retired oncology nurse. His voice was steady. I have maybe 3 months left, probably less. Why didn't you tell us? Because I wanted to fix our family before I died. I wanted to make sure you and Richard would have each other after I was gone. Dad reached across and took my hand. I know the methods were extreme, but Michael, I was desperate. I couldn't bear leaving you boys as strangers to each other. I stared at our joined hands, his thin and cold, mine trembling. Richard's going to hate you when he finds out about the adoption. I said, maybe, or maybe he'll finally understand that being chosen is just as powerful as being born into a family. Dad squeezed my hand. That's where I need your help, Michael. Richard trusts you now in a way he never has before. If anyone can help him see that he's always belonged with us, it's you. I looked out the cabin window at the mountains, thinking about my brother passed out on Dad's couch, broken and angry and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. What do you want me to do? Bring him here. All 3 of us together. One last time. Let me try to explain before the cancer takes that chance away. Getting Richard to the cabin took every ounce of persuasion I had. He was hungover, furious, and in no mood to face the man who'd orchestrated months of psychological manipulation. But when I mentioned Dad's cancer, something in his expression shifted. He's really dying? Richard asked, gripping the Honda's passenger door handle as we wound through the mountain roads. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 3 months, maybe less. Richard stared out the window at the pine trees rushing past. So even that's real. Even his death is real. Just not when we thought it was. Richard, there's something else you need to know before we get there. What now? Don't tell me we're not actually brothers or something insane like that. I kept my eyes on the road. We're not. Not biologically. The silence stretched so long I thought maybe Richard hadn't heard me. When I finally glanced over, his face had gone completely white. What did you just say? Dad told me this morning. You were adopted when you were 3. Your birth parents died in a car accident. Richard's breathing became shallow, rapid. Pull over. Richard, pull the car over right now, Michael. I pulled onto a scenic overlook and stopped. Richard got out immediately, walked to the guardrail, and doubled over like he was going to be sick. I followed him. Richard, are you okay? Am I okay? He straightened up, his eyes wild. My entire life has been a lie, Michael. Every single thing I thought I knew about myself, about our family, about why I never felt like I fit in. It's all been one massive deception. That's not true, isn't it? Richard turned to face me. No wonder I always felt like I had to prove myself. No wonder nothing I ever did was good enough. I wasn't actually his son. You were his son in every way that mattered. Stop. Richard held up his hand. Just stop with the Hallmark card bullshit. I need to think. We stood there for several minutes, the mountain wind cold against our faces. Finally, Richard spoke again. I remember something, he said quietly. I was maybe 4 or 5, and I asked Mom why I didn't look like either of you. She said some families are made by choice, not just by blood. I never understood what that meant. Maybe she was trying to tell you something. Or maybe she was covering for the fact that they never bothered to tell me the truth about who I really was. I watched my brother, adopted brother, struggle with 49 years of identity crashing down around him. Richard, does it change how you feel about Mom and Dad? He was quiet for a long time. I don't know. I loved them. They raised me. But Michael, do you understand what this means? Every achievement, every success I had, I was doing it to prove I belonged in a family that was never actually mine to begin with. It was yours. You were chosen. Chosen. Richard laughed bitterly. That's a nice way to put it. I was a charity case. You were a scared little boy who needed a family, and Mom and Dad gave you one, and then spent the next 46 years never telling me the truth about it. We got back in the car and drove the rest of the way in silence. When we reached the trailhead, Richard looked like he was going to a funeral, which I realized in a way he was. The hike to the cabin felt longer this time. Richard walked behind me, not saying a word, his expensive shoes completely wrong for the mountain trail. Dad was waiting for us on the cabin porch, sitting in a wooden rocking chair with a blanket across his lap. The yellow tinge to his skin was more pronounced now, and he looked frailer than he had that morning. Richard, Dad said, standing slowly, thank you for coming. Richard stopped 20 feet away. Are you really dying, or is that part of the act too? Dad pulled back the blanket to reveal the port in his chest where chemotherapy drugs were administered. It's real. And the adoption? Also real. Richard's hands clenched into fists. How could you not tell me? How could you let me spend my entire life wondering why I never felt like I belonged? Because I was scared, Dad said simply. Scared that if you knew the truth, you'd think you weren't really our son. Well, congratulations, because that's exactly what I think now. Dad stepped down from the porch, moving carefully. Richard, do you remember when you were 7 and you broke your arm falling off your bike? What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what I told you while we waited for the doctor to set the bone? Richard's jaw tightened. You said that sometimes things have to be broken before they can heal properly. And I told you that healing doesn't make you weaker. It makes you stronger in the broken places. Don't you dare use some childhood metaphor to justify lying to me for 46 years. Dad walked closer. Richard, I lied to you about being adopted. I lied to you about dying, but I never lied to you about loving you. Not once, not ever. Love. Richard's voice cracked. You call putting me through months of psychological torture love? I call desperately trying to show you that you don't have to earn your place in this family love, Dad said. You never had to prove you were good enough, Richard. You were always good enough. From the moment we brought you home, scared and grieving and 3 years old, you were our son. Richard was crying now, though I don't think he realized it. But I'm not really your son. Yes, you are. Dad reached out and took Richard's face in his hands. Biology doesn't make a family, Richard. Choice does. Love does. The fact that we chose you, fought for you, raised you, worried about you, celebrated your victories, and mourned your losses, that's what makes you my son. Richard broke down completely then, collapsing into Dad's arms like the scared little boy he'd been 46 years ago. I never felt like I fit, he sobbed. I always felt like there was something wrong with me. There was never anything wrong with you, Dad whispered, holding his son. There was only something wrong with me for not helping you understand that sooner. I stood there watching my father and brother hold each other, both of them crying, both of them finally being honest about the love and fear that had shaped our family for decades. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I thought maybe Dad's insane plan might actually work after all. Dad lived for 4 months, not 3, long enough to see Richard quit his corporate job and start working with me at the veterinary clinic. Long enough to watch his adopted son learn to suture wounds and comfort frightened animals with the same patience he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. You know what's funny? Richard said one afternoon as we closed up the clinic together. I spent 30 years trying to prove I was smart enough to be Dad's son, and it turns out what he really wanted was for me to be kind enough. I looked up from the medical supplies I was restocking. You were always kind, Richard. You just hid it behind all that corporate armor. Maybe. He hung up his scrubs that actually fit him now, not the expensive suits that had defined his identity for decades. Or maybe I just needed permission to be human. Dad died on a Tuesday morning in January, peacefully in his sleep at the cabin with Margaret holding his hand. Richard and I had taken turns staying with him those final weeks, and for the first time in our lives, we worked together without competition or resentment. The real funeral was nothing like the elaborate charade we'd endured months earlier. Just the 4 of us, Richard, Sarah, Margaret, and me, plus Elena and a handful of Dad's genuine friends. Pastor Williams said a few words about redemption and the families we choose versus the ones we're born into. But the moment that mattered most came afterward, when Richard and I were cleaning out the cabin. Look at this, Richard said, holding up a manila folder I hadn't seen before. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings about my veterinary practice, every small article about animals I'd saved, every letter to the editor praising my work, every mention of the free clinics I ran for low-income families. Some of the clippings went back 15 years. He was keeping track, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael, look at the dates. Richard's finger traced the chronology. He started collecting these right after Mom died, right when he started planning his whole psychological experiment. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note, evidence for Richard, proof that success isn't measured in dollars. Your brother has been changing lives while you've been chasing profit. Learn from him. He wanted me to see who you really were, Richard said. Not the struggling veterinarian with the falling down clinic, but the man who chose helping others over making money, again and again for 20 years. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I think he wanted both of us to see who we really were. Richard nodded. Without the masks we'd been wearing our whole lives. 6 months later, Richard used his business expertise to help me expand the clinic into a full-service animal hospital. Not because Sumwell required it, but because he genuinely wanted to be part of something that mattered. We hired 3 more veterinarians and 2 additional support staff, and started offering services to rural communities that had never had access to professional animal care. The grand opening was everything Dad's fake funeral hadn't been. Genuine, joyful, full of people who actually cared about what we were building together. You know what the best part is? Sarah said, watching Richard patiently explain heartworm prevention to a worried pet owner. He's actually good at this. She was right. Richard had channeled his competitive drive into something constructive for the first time in his life. He approached animal care with the same intensity he'd once brought to mergers and acquisitions, except now his success was measured in lives saved rather than dollars earned. Dr. Richard, as the kids in town had started calling him, became something of a local celebrity, not for his business achievements, but for sitting on the floor of the clinic's waiting room, reading stories to children while their pets recovered from surgery. On the first anniversary of Dad's real death, Richard and I drove back up to the cabin. Margaret had decided to stay there permanently, turning it into a small bed and breakfast for hikers and tourists. She'd left Dad's study exactly as it was, and we spent the afternoon going through the rest of his papers. I found something else, Richard said, pulling out a sealed envelope marked to be opened 1 year after my death. Inside was a letter addressed to both of us, and a set of financial documents. Michael and Richard, if you're reading this together, it means my plan worked better than I dared to hope. If you're reading it separately, well, at least I got one of you to the finish line. The enclosed documents establish a trust fund for your future children, not just biological children, but any children you might choose to adopt. Because family, as I hope you've learned, is about choice and love, not blood and biology. Richard, I hope you've discovered that being worthy of love isn't something you have to earn. It's something you already are. You were always my hero, even when you thought you were my disappointment. The money doesn't matter. The inheritance was never about money. It was about making sure you'd take care of each other after I was gone. Your father, Frank. P.S. Richard, your birth parents' names were David and Maria Rodriguez. They were good people who died too soon. I have their photos and some letters if you'd like them someday. You carry the best parts of all 4 of your parents. Richard was crying again, but not the desperate, broken sobs from the cabin. These were tears of gratitude, of understanding, of a man who'd finally found his place in the world. He really did think of everything, he said. I looked around the cabin where Dad had spent his final months orchestrating the most elaborate act of love I'd ever witnessed. Yeah, I said. He really did. We sat there as the sun set behind the mountains. 2 brothers who'd finally learned what family actually meant. Not blood, not inheritance, not competition or achievement, just choice, love, and the courage to keep choosing each other, day after day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Dad would have been proud.